Thank you so much, Maxine. Hi, everyone. And I'm so delighted to see Trish Cooper in the RSVP list. Trish will chat later, but Trish was my boss at the Wits Language School a few years ago, and in fact, one of the co-examiners on my master's a decade ago. So, Trish, it's amazing to see you on this list. All right, so I'm going to take you through a few slides, sort of detailing this new discipline of behavioral linguistics. And it really is just such a pleasure to be chatting to fellow language enthusiasts as part of this webinar. I've done quite a few of these workshops or these sessions, mainly to commerce students or people who are quite well versed in behavioral science. And whenever I get to the sort of parts of language where we're talking about interrogatives or imperatives or passive or active sentence types, I feel like I lose people and they start feeling like it's a bit of a language class. So it's really a pleasure to be chatting to you guys today. And I love starting off with this slide, and I hope it does justice with you watching on your screens at home. And most people follow this in exactly the same way that it is sort of put onto the screen. You'll read this first, so it must be important. Your eyes then tend to follow downwards. Now your eyes are here, then it follows further down and now here, and then you go up to the top left and you'll read this last. And the reason this is so important is because in addition to obviously the sort of semantic choices and the words, and we're going to discuss a lot of that in today's session, we are hardwired to psychologically and behaviorally act in certain ways. And you'll be quite surprised to hear very irrational ways. And so a big part of this discipline, of course, is to be able to communicate to people, knowing how we communicate and knowing the different ways that we respond to various stimuli and how we follow through with a communication journey. And in fact, that's sort of inspired the name of my business, which is called Breadcrumbs. And the idea is that you are following these very well strategically crafted, thought out markers throughout a text, whether that's verbal, whether that's oral, such that you get to a desired end goal, or you get your audience or your readers to that end goal. So behavioral linguistics, it's a very new field internationally, very, very new. In fact, in South Africa, I'm lucky enough to be the first behavioral linguistics firm in the country. And essentially what that means is we are using a multidisciplinary approach which focuses on language and elements of linguistic communication, surely, but it combines it with principles of behavioral science and psychology, really sort of rounding out this discipline as something that you could study in a sort of social sciences environment, definitely in a humanities world. I mean, I think back to my orientation week at my university, Rhodes University, for 10 years ago, and I didn't really know what this field of linguistics really entailed. And I remember sitting in one of those week orientation sessions, and it was Viv de Klerk at the time, started speaking about the communication patterns of dolphins and bees. And without knowing how I was going to then apply clearly what I then chose to do a master's and now subsequently my PhD in, it was just something that really, really, I related to it. And we all use communication, we all use language. And I think that's the beauty really of this discipline, that it's not necessarily this expensive, complicated framework. It really just is a toolkit that anyone can start implementing both in their personal and their professional lives. So our end goal is obviously to be able to nudge action using this framework, this methodology of behavioral linguistics, in order to create compelling content that ultimately persuades people to do something. And straight away, I'm sure red flags are going up and you're thinking the word manipulation. And that's very much something that we discuss and explore, and ethically is a very big part of anything to do with the behavioral sciences field. And we'll get to that a bit later. But certainly the intentions are pure. It's to have someone's best interests at heart, and it's to use communication in such a way that we can help to shape society. Any of you having studied sort of critical discourse analysis as part of sociolinguistics, you know that the Ruth Waddock and the Fairclough sort of school of thought is that language shapes society, and in turn, society is shaped by language. And what behavioral linguistics starts to say is, okay, but how can that then end up being some type of action? So why do we need this? It's a crazy stat, but on any given day, we tend to make between 30 and 40,000 decisions. Now, of course, a lot of those are sort of without us thinking. We stand up, we get out of bed, we get dressed, we brush our teeth, and a lot of these are very automatic processes. But certainly quite a few of them are things that we actually have to stop, pause, and reflect on. And in today's day-to-day life, we're so busy. From the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, there's work demands, school demands, family demands, social media demands. And so where behavioral linguistics is such a powerful tool, I guess, is that you as a person, as a brand, as any type of entity using this framework are able to break through that noise and understand what compels people to act in the ways that they act, and how you can get people to take your message seriously, whether that's changing ideology, whether that's getting them to do a call to action, or just to adopt to some sort of worldview or your viewpoint. And this is how we do it. So I think one of the earlier questions that came through when we were first preparing for the session rather, is how does behavioral linguistics differ from disciplines like NLP or cognitive linguistics? And certainly there's a lot of overlap between these various fields, but the focus with behavioral linguistics is obviously on behavior. And if you have a look at that very overwhelming image up on the screen there, these are called rules of thumb or shortcuts or mental heuristics. And they're various cognitive biases that as human beings, innately, we need to structure these 40,000 decisions in a day. And we rely on pre-existing information. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of messages. So I'm just checking that you guys can hear me. Oh, I'm breaking up apparently. Maxine? Is everything fine your side?
Yeah, it's all fine for me. So I wonder if that's someone's connection.
Got you. Okay, well, please feel free to just interrupt me if I'm going on a tangent and you can't hear me. So we really do rely on these mental shortcuts in order to process information and then make a decision. And in fact, at last count, there was about 188 there on that grid. And certainly as part of my PhD in behavioral linguistics, I'm looking at how you can use language and elements of linguistics to encode or decode as many of those 188 as possible to see which ones appeal more to different sort of demographics or segments that I'm testing. So at its base, behavioral linguistics uses this 3 C's approach. And again, it's really, really about nudging action. And I'm going to chat quite a bit about nudge theory and what a nudge is in a bit. But looking at these 3 C's, we've got content, contact, and context. And again, it's so wonderful chatting to linguists because I don't need to go into too much detail about these terms. But content, we're looking at our words, we're looking at grammar structures, we're even looking at pronunciation and how things sound. And this is obviously very critical when you're doing content marketing, let's just say, as part of like a radio campaign. You know, the sing-song ability of words and the rhyme and alliteration and assonance and all these wonderful things that we're so familiar with end up being really, really nudgy. So we'll discuss that in a bit. Visual language. So whether this is sort of paralinguistic cues, if we're speaking face to face and you're seeing things happening with like my eyes and gestures, and then certainly visual language, the colors that people choose, the imagery. I mean, so much goes into this type of these types of decisions. It's remarkable. You may know that using a color like blue as an example is a huge trust color. And if you're trying to get people to buy into a concept and trust you, maybe as a brand or as a NGO or a government, using shades or hues of blue has shown to obviously increase that sort of stickiness of your message. Moving on to contact, that's who's getting the audience essentially, who's getting your message, and trying to understand as much as we can about these people so that you can tailor make your message and personalize it to such a point that people feel like you're only emailing them as an example. So I know we get multiple emails in a day, and if you think of the big brands that mail us, whether it's your bank, your insurance company, I think we do know behind the scenes that no, you're not getting an individual email. It is a bit of a data field pull from a Excel spreadsheet. But where you get the email saying, "Hi Leigh, your dog Asterix must join us at Craigle Park Park Run. It's going to be 26 degrees Celsius this weekend." You know, where you pull in that personalized information, it does make your message so much more compelling. And obviously a lot of that is semantics. And that's located within this contact quadrant. And then moving on to context. So I've taken you through a few of those, essentially what a mental heuristic is. And with context, we're really relying on various things. So it's seasonality, time of day, where you are in the world, so geographic location. But then it's looking at these innate parts of human behavior that, again, compel us to act or actually not act a lot more of the time. So here's a great example of a picture I took in the subway in New York City last year. Feels like a lifetime ago. And this really sort of drives home the point of the 3 C's coming together quite wonderfully. And you'll see that says, "Dear person who currently has a bead of sweat dripping down their back, wouldn't you rather be sweating in Fiji? Book now, hotels.com. Be there, do that, get rewarded." And then just very quickly, rather than it seeming like a bit of a critical discourse analysis, which it's not, here are some of the things that are obviously happening within this essentially advert that are bringing behavioral linguistic principles into play. We've got the context there. "Dear person, I was hot." It was, I think it was May. It was really warm in the subway. I did actually have a bead of sweat dripping down my back. So seeing that straight away, relating to that, I think was quite powerful. Of course, they wouldn't have this ad up in the middle of winter. So that's an important point. Just the sort of layout that you can see there, it's mimicking an Instagram post for those of us who use Instagram. There's the visual cue of the arrow pointing at, it's making your eye follow the imperative action-based book now. You're following that arrow to the brand, hotels.com. At that stage, you've got the tripling effect, which is the sing-song, be there, do that, get rewarded. And we're going to discuss something called rhyme as reason later on as part of this session. Colors session. Colors, red, hot, urgent, better. There's a bit of now I can hear my now. Let me just turn that down because that's throwing me. And of course, wouldn't you rather be sweating in Fiji? We can see that's the interrogative, that's the question type of statement. And that's hugely important because as humans, we have something called unit bias, which means when something starts, we want to finish it. And it's why if you're sitting in your car on your way to work and there's a song playing, if you don't let the song finish before you get out of your car to go into the office or, well, former life, wherever you're going, you have that song kind of on repeat in your mind. And that's because we like to finish things once we've started them. And it works the same with the interrogative case. We are a Q&A a species. So where there's a question, despite yourself, you want to answer it. So that kind of just gives a broad overview of how you can apply some of those principles, certainly in an advertising content marketing space. So I thought it'd be quite useful to take you through the concept of the nudge, because I mean, essentially that's what behavioral linguistics is really founded upon. And that is, how do you gently nudge, push someone into making a decision that you want them to? And I think the most crucial part of understanding a nudge is knowing that it's freedom of choice. So it's not a mandated rule or some type of law. That wouldn't be a nudge because you don't get the choice whether you follow that or not. A nudge really is something that you can decide to do or decide not to do. And so in that photo, we have Professor Cass Sunstein. So any of you who follow behavioral economics or have potentially read Nudge, which was the sort of founding book of this theory, will know Cass. And I always say that if I can't use my own methods of behavioral linguistic persuasion to ultimately get what I want to get out of some type of interaction, then, you know, what am I doing? It's really a pointless discipline. And one of the things I did do last year was manage to send him an email and use some of these sort of principles to get a meeting with him, which was absolutely phenomenal. That's me pictured next to him in his office at the Harvard Law School in Boston, and just really exciting to have obviously met him, but also to have introduced him to a lot of the linguistic elements, which, interestingly enough, I mean, he was fascinated by, but certainly not something that he's studied or prioritized in his academic career as a professor of law and of behavioral economics. So looking to that grid, and I don't want to get too academic here, but there are 4 types of nudges, I guess you'd say, and you can rate them on whether they're a good nudge or a bad nudge, and whether they're low friction, so easy to do, or whether there's high friction, so lots of barriers. And perhaps without even going through that, I can take you to some of the cartoon character nudge family guides that we created last year to really make these various nudges quite tangible. So taking you through these quite briefly, we've got the dutiful nudge, moving to the dark nudge, the deliberate nudge, and then dreadful sludge, which is a brand new term actually that was coined last year by Cass. And when you're looking at dutiful nudges, you're looking at incentives or things that are going to get you to do something that's in your best interests. And for those of us in South Africa, the best example here is the Vitality program. And in fact, even those of you internationally, you might be aware of Vitality because it has sort of expanded quite globally. And so those are like discounts on healthy food, it's discounts on your gym, it's getting you to save more money, exercise more, and eat more healthily, and it's rewarding you for doing that. We won't go into all the reasons why that works out for the insurers themselves, but certainly there's incentives and there's excitement attached to this dutiful nudge that gets you to choose those good, healthy behaviors. Moving on to the dark nudge, this now moves us more into a space of you're driving home, you're tired, and you see the McDonald's arches, and you decide that the 2-for-1 burger special is something that's quite compelling to you. So this is a dark nudge. I mean, again, you have the choice. You don't have to stop and buy the takeout. But it's so compelling, it's so tempting, and they play on all sorts of behavioral biases to get you to want to do that. But the important thing with dark nudge is you'll see a lot of dark nudges come Black Friday specials and all sorts of things. But your best interests aren't at the dark nudges. It's not as priority. Then looking on to the deliberate nudge. Deliberate nudge is still in your best interests, but if you go back to this original graph, you'll see there's high friction there. So what deliberate nudge is trying to do is say to you, look, you need to do the good thing, so I'm going to make the bad thing hard to do. Again, you've got that freedom of choice. And there's some amazing examples in this space of gun law in the States. I mean, we know how topical that is. So rather than taking away anyone's choice to buy a firearm, they suddenly introduced all sorts of things like cool-off periods and waiting periods. So you could go in and sort of buy the firearm, but you could only come back in 2 weeks to pick it up. And as a result of that tiny little bit of deliberate nudging, they saw huge or drastic reductions of homicide-related gun issues. So deliberate nudge is a really clever way of saying, I know what you want to do. I'm going to make it very hard to do that so that you do the better thing. Moving on to dreadful sludge. This, again, if we go back to the previous slide, this is time-wasting stuff. You're filling in forms. You are queuing for ages for some type of license or fund. And another example there is the federal grants available to disadvantaged students in the States, where I think they have to do something crazy like submit their parents' tax returns for the past decade in order to qualify for this relief. And of course, a lot of the times they're not able to do that, or it's hard, or it's just, it's too time consuming. So what is in their best interests ultimately doesn't end up being something that they get as a result of just terrible, terrible, onerous paperwork. very briefly, I want to show you how we've adapted these to be more corona conscious and give some really tangible examples of how it's working in the COVID-19 space. Potentially walking into supermarkets and having those social distancing stickers on the floor to really show you or nudge you that you need to be that 2 meters away from people. That's a great example of a dutiful nudge. Dark nudges, I mean, you can see our little guy sitting on hoarded toilet paper. Dark nudges really just speak to anything where people were trying to take advantage. There were a lot of scams and stuff happening during this time. A lot of banks who promised relief or payment holidays, or in fact, monetary loans, ended up really augmenting interests, as an example, and so it really wasn't in people's ultimate best interest to take up the fairly tempting offer. Deliberate nudge is a great example there in Sweden of, and I mean, you might know that Sweden really didn't enforce any type of mandated or law-based lockdown, and one of the things that they did instead was they went and dumped a whole bunch of manure in all of the public parks, and such large amounts of this, obviously, that the smell was quite overwhelming. And so you could still choose to go and sit in the park if you wanted to, sure, with a group of friends, but you were far less likely to take your group of mates and go and sit in quite a smelly park. And as a result, you were obviously being deliberately nudged to stay home. And then dreadful sludge, easy one. The relief funds, the criteria people had to go through, the paperwork, the telephone calls, all that sort of thing. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of how the 4 different categories of nudge work. And then obviously within a behavioral linguistics field, we're trying to upweight dutiful nudges, deliberate nudges. We're trying to do what's called a sludge audit to see where the communication dreadful sludge points are, such that we can reduce those as much as possible. And there's this huge caution of avoiding the perils of a dark nudge. And certainly that's something that my team think about on an almost sort of weekly basis, where we've been approached by sort of tobacco companies and fast food chains to help promote or advertise their brands. And we've had to take quite a hard line of, if it doesn't fit in the dutiful and deliberate and eradicating dreadful sort of pillars, we won't go there, because it's quite a powerful framework, and we need to be able to sleep at night knowing that we're nudging people to ultimately do the things that are in their best interest and that are good for them, not the 10 McDonald's burgers on their way home from work. So I thought these would be some cool examples to show you behavioral linguistics in action. This is taken from arguably the nudgiest bookstore in the world, which is also in New York, Strand Bookstore. And you'll see various things happening here. And this is probably not new to you guys. You've probably incorporated some of these in your own writing or content marketing or whatever fields of linguistics or language communication you're in. But if you have a look at some of these, snuggle up and read me, straight away we see there's the personal pronoun me, and we'll discuss that a bit later as well, but that's very, very compelling. The immediate intimacy building that you can create. Hey youps over here, that's obviously quite attention grabbing. Oh my god, a lot of people who I present to don't actually know what that reference is. So that's actually just it's like a social media, I don't know, term, slang, which is like OMG, but in a different way. There's a bit of a meme attached to that. Rainy day ahead, obviously we're speaking to the 3 C's there. There's a lot of contextual stuff happening. It'll make you miss your subway stop. Take me to the beach. Again, we've got that pronoun. Ignore your unread books by me instead. Love that one. And then on the right-hand side there, suggested by President Obama. So we've got like voice of the expert coming through there. We're lazy at heart. And I think I've mentioned that as humans, we're lazy and irrational in a lot of the decisions we make or a lot of the engagements we have. So where you can make things easy for people and where you can almost say to them, look, you don't have to do the work here of the thinking. We're suggesting this to you because this amazing icon of a man has read this book. It really does make it a lot more compelling. And in fact, I chatted to the store manager on that day, and that book was obviously flying off the shelves. And it comes back to that moral, ethical code, because who's to say that he actually did recommend that? They could have a whole box of books that aren't moving, and throw on that little sign, and they would likely see the same type of effect. So it really does come back to this moral code that I think anyone who is working in the behavioral sciences world needs to adhere to. Moving on to the grocery store, like eating an edible orb of sweet California sunshine instead of saying that these are apricots. And again, as linguists, we know how powerful words can be. We know how evocative they can be. You're not selling the apricots. You're selling the picnic with the friends. You're selling the fun day in the sunshine. You're selling health, high in vitamin C, potassium, dietary fiber. So there's some amazing things that are happening both overseas and locally. This is from a store called Trader Joe's, who've actually been studied as one of the most behaviorally nuanced grocery stores. They refuse to stock more than 3 or 4 of the same type of product because they know there's something called decision paralysis. And again, it's speaking to our inherent laziness, which sounds a bit negative, but we have so many decisions to make, and we're so busy, and there's a lot going on. So if you walk into let's say a Woolworths, and you're presented with 30 types of mayonnaise, chances are you actually just so overwhelmed by it, you just walk out without having bought the mayo. And Trader Joe's recognized that quite early on, and so they started limiting their product line to just really make it easy, that it's this grab and go type of environment. And here are a couple more examples before we move on. Love this first one. This is just a mock-up I've done, but it's an actual example. Exactly 25% prior to the end of a book, this message popped up: the end. Are you a smoker? You'll live a 25% shorter life than non-smokers. So here's where your story ends. And it just makes it so much more tangible in that contextual moment where you're like, hang on, but I've got so much more to say. I've got so many more years of life to live. But as a smoker, you're told quite intensely that you're done. The middle example's amazing. Again, Sweden. So what they did was they triggered an SMS that would be sent to you if you were a blood donor when your blood was used to save someone's life. And it was a very easy process because they were already scanning the blood bags, and all that happened was you suddenly got an SMS and it said, Leigh, your donated blood just saved someone's life. Thank you so much. And the results of that, and it's another wonderful thing about behavioral linguistics, it's very outcomes based. So you can run these experiments or these tests, and you can fairly real time see how people are responding. And in this example, they were just trying to encourage people to become repeat donors, because soon after that SMS, you got another SMS to tell you when the next blood bank was going to be in your neighborhood. But because of word of mouth and how exciting this was and how proud people were of this type of message, they ended up obviously acquiring brand new donors into the space, which was a huge win for them. And then that last example just really shows framing, and this will be something that we're all very familiar with. How you frame your message is so important. So here, this is taken in London. Instead of saying you're going to be fined for littering, this is positioned as you can save 150 Rand by not littering. And what's so critical there is it's playing to a principle called loss aversion. And loss aversion is super powerful, and it's been replicated in multiple studies to show that it really, really works. We are far more likely, in fact, we're twice as likely to feel the loss of something we already have than we are to feel the gain of something. So telling people that they already have 50 Rand waiting for them in Uber Eats vouchers that's going to expire, versus telling them if they do something, they will win or earn 50 Rands Uber Eats vouchers. We know that that means the same thing intuitively, but we feel in the first example that that is already ours, and losing it just feels that much worse. So that's loss aversion. So you'll see at the bottom right there, I'm tracking our slides, 13 out of 21. It's that unit bias, so that we're all following through and we can kind of track how much further to go. I've got 7 quick tips here that's going to be probably quite familiar to you from your linguistics background, of things that you can already start implementing in any type of communication. Again, whether it's spoken, whether it's written, whether it's in your personal life, whether it's professional. There's 7 very quick tips that we can go through. First one, very obvious, keep it short. And in fact, the more and more that I work with clients like these big insurers or these banks, financial services institutions, where potentially they're talking about, like, let's just say investments, the jargon that comes through, and I mean, at its root, if you use something, the flesh readability test, and I know that's a very basic thing for a lot of people, but how many syllables are in words and sentences and paragraphs really does make a difference to how people are able to understand what you're saying. And even more importantly, in the behavioral linguistics world, where it's simple and understandable, so plain language essentially, it's more credible. So people actually believe it more and they trust you more as the messenger. So you'll see the example there I've given visually is of our favorite, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And this dates back to the 2000 and whatever was it, 16 elections, gosh, I don't even know, where they did a very interesting linguistic analysis between their sort of roadshow speeches, presentations. And they compared Donald Trump's to Hillary's, and they came back and they saw that Donald's was really aimed at a sort of, in our world, standard 5, grade 7 comprehension level, whereas Hillary's was slightly more advanced than that. It was more of a high school level. And again, what they found was that if people are focusing too much on what you're saying and really trying to cognitively process it, when it comes to you asking them to do whatever the call to action is, they've kind of like, they're kind of over it. They've built up this fatigue and there's been this choice overload, and you know, you don't end up getting ultimately what you want from them. So this big tip, obviously, where you can use a flesh readability score, I think there's the Fish-Kinneard one, and various other methods of really keeping your sentences and your communication as short and punchy as possible. It's not just in your own best interest and people understanding it, it's actually making the communication far more nudgy. Moving on to tip 2, nudgy numbers. So still linguistic. We're looking at the difference here between using numbers as numbers and then actually writing the numbers out. So in fact, I'm going to start on the right-hand side there with that example from an insurer in America called Lemonade. $631,540.07 donated. That's hard to read when we've written the number out as words, and that's done strategically. If something's harder to read or harder to sort of process, it gives it a feeling of scale and mass. And that's exactly what they were trying to go for here. They were trying to show how huge this donation was that their members had managed to contribute to. And so by writing it out like that, we get a sense of this being this big number. And of course, it also catches our attention when we see a number written like that. Looking in the middle now, the point here is about not using a guesstimate or a guesstimate number where you can use the actual number. So if I said to you, look, as part of Reach for a Dream Foundation, we want to send 10 children to Florida, and we need to raise $37,263. You feel like that's the real number. And hopefully it is, again, going back to the sort of moral, ethical code. You feel like someone's had a spreadsheet and they've done the line items of all the different accommodation, transport, whatever costs, and they've come up with that number. And if you believe the number's real, you're actually far more likely to then make a donation to the cause as a result of feeling like it's trustworthy and credible. And then the last nudgy number point on the left-hand side there, you're trying to look for something to break through that noise again. So we've got a bit too used to top 5, top 10 numbers. You know, the usual multiples of 5 actually are the ones you should completely avoid. Whereas if I threw 23 ways to lock down safely, as an example, that 23 is going to pique your interest because it's just unusual. And as soon as things are unusual and they grab your attention, you are, I want to say halfway there, but probably only a quarter way there. But you have essentially stopped someone in their tracks, and they are more likely to then listen or read on. So the point there is just to choose numbers that maybe aren't as common. So this will appeal to my fellow linguists. Think about tense. English has a very strong future tense. So we know this. And what I mean by this is we almost mark it in two different ways in a sentence. We use markers like will, and then we tend to give this sort of time-based tomorrow, next week, next year. And as a result of that doubling up, it means that we have a very strong future tense. And why is this important behaviorally? Humans aren't actually wired to care about the future, which is a crazy thing. It's called present bias, where we really are into short-term gratification, instant gratification, and where you're presented with a choice, as an example, of a coffee today or an undefined, maybe bigger prize in the future, you're far more likely to want to take the immediate prize. So where this works, and there's an amazing paper there, I put the reference, Keith Chen, The Effect of Language on Economic Behavior. What Chen looked at was in languages like Mandarin and Finnish, as an example, they have a very weak future tense. So they speak, in that second example there, I donate money, obviously that would be our present tense, and then they just throw in the marker of whether it's next week, tomorrow, next year. And what Chen's research showed was that where we're more located in the present tense, we're more likely to act, even though counterintuitively that's better for our future, if I'm making any sense. So he found that Mandarin speakers, as an example, obviously solving for a lot of other variables, were far more likely to eat more healthily, exercise more, save more, look after their communities, donate to charities, and in a way prioritize their futures by focusing on immediate action. So the advice there is there's nothing we can do. English is English, and we've got our tenses the way they are. But where you can locate things in an immediate present, again, that does compel people to act more urgently than if you say, you need to do this for the future. And it's why, again, going back to like a vitality example, your coffee or smoothie, any of you guys on Vitality Active Rewards, any of these reward loyalty programs, that coffee smoothie at the end of a week ultimately gets you to train harder and save better and drive better, which ends up being something that obviously helps you in the future. How are we doing for time? Oh goodness, okay, let me speed through these ones. I don't need to spend too much time on the perfect pronoun. We kind of dealt with that. Pronouns are so critical and important, and certainly towards the end of 2019 became such a topic of sort of social angst with people saying, ask me what my pronoun is, ask me how I identify. And I think that's one of the reasons why using pronouns in text, verbally or again, written text, is so critical, because you can form othering relationships, us, them. You can obviously build intimacy, we, our, together, this feeling of coming together and doing stuff as a unit. And then you can also use voice of expert, so I and my, and obviously well-placed, in well-placed examples, thought leadership pieces, you do want to get that person who you see as the expert. So perfect pronoun, look for the pronouns, and then obviously use them accordingly based on what you're trying to achieve. Sentence type, imperative, interrogative, declarative. I have to get those right with you guys. I could have pretended with my other audiences, but I know that you'll know the right ones there. Commanding someone to do something in a cold call environment, not going to happen. You can only get to the sort of verb-based imperatives once you've formed some type of relationship with your audience. We already discussed how questions are so great because they're engaging and interactive. And a well-placed declarative statement and short sentences can also be great in sort of weaving this wonderful narrative that ends up sounding nice and appealing to people orally. Rhyme is reason. So this is actually one of those, if you think back to that wheel that I showed you at the beginning with the 188 rules of thumb, this is one of them. And I love this one from a linguistic point of view, if you think about phonetics. So rhyme is reason basically says that, well, let's look at these examples, in fact. On a menu with fish, tuna is often the most popular dish, versus on a menu with fish, the majority of people choose tuna. So, I mean, these mean the same thing. But obviously you can see that in the first example, fish and dish rhyme. And so I've done some very anecdotal research on this to supplement, obviously, bodies of work that have already been done. And it's just quite remarkable that the thing that I did came back with exactly the same percentage. And that is that 67% of people are more likely to respond well to A than they are to B. And if this was a bit more interactive, I obviously would have asked you guys to please put your hands up to show me which one you would have thought would be more credible. Sorry, that's the critical point here. Which one do you believe to be more true? And the reason for this is quite fascinating, and it shows just how behavioral linguistics ties into psychology and all sorts of cognitive disciplines. And it's that when we grew up, caretakers, whether that's our parents, whether it was older siblings, school teachers, most of the narratives we were told as children were rhyming or sing-song, or there was a lot of rhyme and rhythm in that. And these were people that we attributed to be trustworthy and people in our lives that were credible. And by some crazy biological whatever, this is now carried through our whole lives. So where we have attributed, people in our lives that have been trustworthy, like our parents, and they've told us these stories, it's meant that we've carried this through to our adult years, and where there is rhyme in some type of phrase, we're far more likely to believe that it's true, which again just points to the sort of irrationality. And I always pause here to say, look, I'm completely involved in this world. I work with this stuff every single day, and I am still just as nudgeable, manipulatable, depending on what type of nudge we're talking about, as anyone else. And certainly, I think as you become more and more aware of it, you might look out for it and you might be less susceptible to it. But it really does go back to, we're making so many decisions and we're kind of like on this sort of automatic path in our day-to-day lives. So these things really do sneak up on us and can be quite persuasive. And the final tip, social proofing. No matter what we say, we might want to consider ourselves individual beings and unique. And that's all wonderful. We're not. As a human species, we like to follow the herd and we like to do what other people are doing. And there's a sort of mass persuasion of, oh, well, if they're doing it, I need to do it. If they're getting it, why am I not getting it? So we really do sort of adhere to the social proofing or social herding bias. And there's been some amazing linguistic examples in the UK of how messaging can be tailored to incorporate the social proofing concept to get people to pay taxes on time or pay their taxes, submit their taxes. And it can be as simple as saying, 87% of your street have already done this. Click here to do it, or make sure you call us to complete yours. And as soon as we feel like we're an outlier and that everyone else is doing it, that we're far more compelled to want to do it ourselves. And in fact, great example, mask wearing. If you've been out and about in South Africa, certainly, I am so delighted that wearing a cloth fabric mask has become a social norm in our country, which is such a relief, because it's more about spotting the people that aren't wearing the mask, certainly when I go out, than it is about seeing people, the other way around. And as a result of that, you can be sure the person who's not wearing a mask feels like the outsider, and they're far more likely the next time to wear the mask, which really, really just does help us from a health and safety point of view at the moment. And my last point before we move on to questions is behavioral linguistics is all about testing, and it's really, really quite a fun discipline, because things change, and it's definitely not to say that what works for one population group necessarily works for another. I've done a lot of work in the space that there are innate behavioral things that certainly do transcend age groups, racial groups, cultural groups, language groups. But that context is so important. And so without testing, obviously, you're not able to see what's worked and how it's worked and what's gone wrong. And that the slide I've got up there is a great example of a grocery store in Canada where it did go wrong. So basically what they wanted to do was to stop people from needing plastic bags after they'd done their grocery shop, and to encourage them to start bringing in their, those sustainable, reusable ones. So they branded their plastic bags with fairly embarrassing semantics: colon care, weird adult video emporium, wart ointment. And obviously the thinking there was, people are going to be ashamed to have to walk around with these bags, so it's gonna nudge them deliberately to bring their own bag from home next time. What happened was, these became like a viral social media whatever meme, and everyone wanted to collect them. So not only were people going in and doing their grocery shop and using one bag, they were actually asking to split out their purchases such that they could collect this limited edition series of 3 matching bags. And that's called the Cobra effect. It's based on this sort of old belief that in colonial times in India, the British soldiers couldn't cope with all the cobras. So they basically said, if you spoke to all the local people and said, if you kill cobras and bring them to us, we will financially reward you. What happened was, because it became this financial reward, the local community started to breed the cobras such that they could then breed them and bring them in, make money, and it became like a little bit of an entrepreneurial business. Obviously, once they figured out that was the case, the incentivized Cobra program was disbanded. But that's where this Cobra effect name comes from. That things, intuitively you could think it could work, but until you've actually tried it out, you're not entirely sure. And then that's just a little plug. I've started a virtual book club as part of Breadcrumbs. So if anyone wants to join, we'd love to have you join us. We're aiming to be the biggest virtual book club in South Africa in the next month or so. And yeah, so if you'd like to join, please just drop us a mail there. Over to you, Maxine.
Leigh, thank you so much. Wow, I have learned so much from your presentation. I have been commenting on the side. We don't have any questions there. Okay, so maybe to get started, Leigh, yes. I enjoyed this question, so it's a bit of my own bias getting to pick the question. This person commented saying, this is referring to the COVID-19 pandemic across the world, that a number of governments have been framing the pandemic in the context of war. And so, for example, teachers and medical workers, first responders are on the front line. And people have been calling for less militarized language use. How do you think that this metaphor maybe negatively affects the way people act, or maybe positively as well? If you'd like to comment on that.
Really love that question. And in fact, I was involved in some research at the end of last year, which looked at where cancer patients and obviously different framing of messaging with cancer patients. And the result was where you had these militaristic metaphors like, let's fight, and this is a battle, and we're going to win, and and that type of language, people actually felt a lot more fatalistic. And it's crazy here how language and ideology and then ultimately action can be so intertwined. But they were looking at patients who were in various stages, obviously, of their treatment or recovery. And there was definitely a correlation between those who just said where they see this militaristic, these metaphors and that type of language, it wasn't helpful. And in many ways, I feel that this is something we'll have to study in the years to come when we look back at this horrific pandemic. But my gut feel is the same thing's going to be the case there, that when you feel like something's going to war or that it's a battle, it makes it feel hard. And that's the opposite of how we should be trying to make certainly our citizens feel at the moment. We need things to feel easy. We need them to feel manageable, because otherwise you get this fatigue. And I'm sure we've all felt it. Like, you know, the first maybe 2 weeks of our level 5 lockdown, we were like, yeah, we can do this. We can stay home. But as we've moved away from that epicenter of trauma, which for us was really, you know, sort of end of March, we've become a lot more complacent in how we act. So where you need to now nudge communities and nudge citizens, it has to be done using very easy language, very accessible language, so that people feel like they've got this. Not that they need to armor up and go to war, because very few people respond to that in the ways we want them to. We should be feeling like this is an everyday thing. It's so easy. Pop your mask on, make sure you're washing your hands properly, social distance, reduce contact with people. And these are all like easy things that you can do to then ultimately, and I don't even want to say beat, because again, that's, you know, using that same type of metaphorical language. But certainly metaphorical language is hugely important in the space. I mean, if I think back to some work I did previously on xenophobia, where it was referring to immigrants as swarms and hordes and, you know, sort of tidal references of, you know, hoarding into areas. Like, it really does dehumanize communities. And so I always caution the use of metaphors, and rather than just going with something that seems like it sounds poetic and we see it and now, you know, journalists are using it, to really stop and think, what type of sentiment ultimately are those words evoking?
Thanks, Leigh. We have a question from the audience. They ask you to please comment on guerrilla advertising. So, for example, like Nando's adverts. And then also possibly to add to that, the role of culture. For example, I think Nando's is effective because they speak to the multilingual audience. That would be really nice if you could comment on that.
Super. So I'm glad somebody brought up sort of multilingualism, because that's very topical at the moment. We've just finished doing a series of hand washing posters, translated obviously into all of South African languages. And where that's a sort of catch-22 is that, yes, in your mother tongue, in your spoken language, you are more persuaded by what you're consuming without question. Where it becomes slightly tricky is what the subject matter is. So I'll give you an example of some research that was done a few years ago in Kenya. They were trying to encourage a local Swahili population to use an app to save more money. And the thought, and it's amazing, it's almost this Cobra effect. The thought was, we should make sure that this is in Swahili. The app needs to be in Swahili, the marketing material, the pamphlets, the field workers, everything needs to be obviously in the mother tongue. And the intention was wonderful, but they saw that it didn't work. And then afterwards, they had these focus group sessions and they spoke to the community and said, but why didn't this work? And the response is quite phenomenal, and was that English is still seen as this dominant language and the language of power. And where things are in English in certain communities, they're seen as more credible and more reliable, more trustworthy. Whereas they saw the Swahili as, oh, hang on, this is not as good a product or savings option as, I don't know, Barclays Bank, let's just say, who happen to be operating in Kenya as well. So it's this interesting test of providing communication to communities, obviously that they can understand and that they can act on, but also understanding the context of sometimes if it's financially oriented or if it's very strong in a health as a health topic, there is still this English dominance that is so ingrained in people, which is just something to be sort of cognizant of. And then, apologies, what was the first part of your question?
It was commenting on Nando's use of guerrilla advertising. Sure.
So I think guerrilla marketing aside, I think any brand that can speak to its audience authentically and sincerely is going to win people over, and you're going to trust that brand. And Nando's has done it wonderfully because they're an accessible brand, and they are a brand that appeals to all different segments in a population, different demographics, and they've always been the first to sort of have this like cheeky political commentary, and it's always been wonderful that they've, they work with Ogilvy Agency, so they've been able to draw on expertise from various, certainly from a multilingual point of view, because the worst thing would be to try and roll something out like this as a brand and like not get the slang right, or like be obviously wrong in the word choice. So I will certainly never be a brand that's able to do that, and that's because I couldn't do it authentically. Where a brand can, I think it's absolutely phenomenal. Nando's gets away with it. I'm trying to think of other brands. If Woolworths tried to do that, I don't think it would resonate as much. Maybe because Woolworths is a slightly higher LSM type of brand, anyways. But certainly, it's a risk as a brand to take. But if you invest in it, and if you have the staff members who are creating this communication, the employees who are able to do it authentically, then I think it's great. If you are a fully white team and you're outsourcing a couple of words here and there just to throw in some sort of vernacular flavor, I think that's where people see through you. And that's obviously a very dangerous thing.
Leigh, thank you so much. We have another question. The questioner has said we can avoid it if we want to avoid politics, but I think it is very good to talk about. Currently, there's a lot of support around Black Lives Matter, that there is this major systemic racism that people are not dealing with at the moment. And
100%.
Many people who don't understand that context want to retaliate and say, oh, but all lives matter. Would you like to talk about that and how we can use behavioral linguistics there?
I'd love to, actually. It's so topical, and actually an oversight that wasn't brought up by me as part of this discussion. The Black Lives Matter movement is not a new movement. It predates many, many years. And in fact, I think the first time we really, really saw it powerfully on social media was a good 3-4 years ago. And at that stage, it was very much a small pocket or a small community of people, mainly in the States, who were using it. And certainly it gained traction, but nowhere near the levels of what we're seeing now. And it goes back to that social proofing comment I made earlier, that as we see more and more people joining this, if you're not part of it, you've become the odd one out. And in this context, that's amazing, because we do want more and more people to be taking this seriously, to be reading up on about it, educating. And certainly there's been people in my lives, acquaintances who I've seen in the past posting an All Lives Matter post. That's not acceptable anymore as it maybe was 3 or 4 years ago. And immediately you'll see people piling in. Facebook's become quite a nightmare place to be generally, but you'll see people piling in with, no, this is why it's important. And there's been amazing analogies, actually. Like if your neighbor's house is on fire, sure, all houses matter in the street. But if the fire department's coming to save your neighbor's house, that's the house they must focus on, because that's the house that's burning down. And I think that people are trying to use far more tangible language to make that point. Because essentially Black Lives Matter, it's a movement, it's this philosophical debate. And until you allow people to understand it really at a base level, I don't think, and it becomes so ideological, and then you feel like you're fighting for your race, and that you're not. It really is this hard environment. And I mean, it brings up the point of naming conventions. Even earlier, when I said to you guys, I studied at Rhodes University, I kind of cringed when I said Rhodes University, because it just feels so like non-politically correct to say that now. And without question, that name's gone. Like give it some time, that name's gone. In the same way that Grahamstown's no longer called Grahamstown, I think it's now Makanda. And we're seeing this rise of words matter, names matter, identity matters. And glorifying relics of colonial past and unequal contexts through using names. People are taking ownership, and they're saying, hang on, we're not calling that anymore. And if you'd spoken to me 15 years ago when I don't know what changed name, when Pretoria became Swanee, I would have been one of those people that's like, oh, we're spending too much effort on this. And how much money are we now spending on changing all the signs from Pretoria to Swanee? Like I would have been one of those I just didn't get it. And I really just encourage people, if anyone's rolling their eyes at me right now and you haven't got it yet, just read, engage, speak to people, and you'll start to realize how, and in fact, you're preaching to the converted as linguists. You know how important words are, and the power that a word can give. And a great example at the moment is that New York Times have completely changed their style guide. They no longer refer to climate, global warming. It's called global heat, because warming was too neutral a word, if that makes sense. And it's not a climate skeptic, it's a climate denier. And they started to make these very specific semantic changes to really like have this ideological shift of, no, hang on, you're not a skeptic, you're a denier, you're a vaccine denier. There's no way that you're going to have this like sort of middle ground, because then that obviously helps encourage ultimately terrible behavior.
Leigh, wow, that's great. Thank you. We are running out of time, so I will open the floor for one more question. I see it's here in the chat. I haven't read it yet. Oh, okay. So it's going back to framing the corona pandemic as war and asking if you know if a similar metaphor is used in other languages. So, for example, he says in Swedish, the person says in Swedish, they don't talk about the corona pandemic as war.
Okay, that's very interesting. Does it say, does he go on to say, is this Bjorn? How do you talk about it?
Well, I live in the United Arab Emirates, so I don't speak Swedish very much, but it sounds very weird to refer to the pandemic as war. But I think we will probably use more organic metaphors, I guess, like growing or, I don't know, expanding or spreading or something like that. But not really war. It sounds weird to me.
Look, we are seeing a lot of that type of narrative as well. Infection spreading, numbers growing, exponential growth, that sort of thing. I think the point there with the metaphor is just that where you frame it as going to war, it's not so much about it's almost giving this power to coronavirus, as crazy as that sounds, because at the moment it does have us like completely control over us. But it's taking agency away from us. I think that's the important point. And where we feel like we don't have agency or we don't have control, there's almost a sense of like, well, then why bother? Why am I wearing a mask? I'm going to get it in 3 weeks' time anyways. Like, and it's this sort of this big thing that we just can't. And again, I'm trying to be very careful with my own language because I want to say defeat, but it's going back, and it's very, very tricky to avoid these things that are so like almost second nature in how we speak about it. But I think my point would just be, certainly verbally you thinking on the spot, and it might be a lot more difficult, but if you are crafting a piece of written communication, just to be aware that a metaphor to you that sounds completely normal and acceptable actually can have, like in my example of the cancer patients, like a real world life consequence. And yeah, so it would just be to, again, going back to make things easy, make them feel like they are in our control, because then we're far more likely to act in the ways we need to.
All right, thank you so much. I am going to bring the webinar to a close. We've got a few thank yous in the chat there for you, Leigh. So I would like to say thank you very much, Leigh, for giving us such an interesting discussion about nudge language and how to nudge behavior through language. I learned a lot, and I'm going to think about how to use the first principle of keeping it short when I do my academic presentations. And I want to also thank all our participants. Some of you are joining us very late in the evening. Thank you so much for participating. Please have a lovely evening or morning further. We don't have another webinar lined up yet. We're going to take a bit of a break, but I will post back in the Facebook event so you can have an idea of what it will be. and you will get the recording if you asked for it sometime next week. So thank you very much, everyone. Leigh, in closing, would you like to give us your Twitter handle so people can follow you, tweet you?
Sure, I'd love that. So we're on Twitter and we're on Instagram and Facebook. And in fact, I'm going to type it into the little window here. I'm going to spell it correctly. That's the first thing. Oh, glory. At Breadcrumbs ZA, and you can find us on the various channels. And I'd love to engage with you guys. So if you've seen any cool research or you have any more questions or your own thoughts, I mean, because this is such a cool emerging field, and I think it's going to be shaped you know, over the next couple of years, certainly from a foundation point of view. So please do get in touch if you want to chat anything behavioral.
Thank you so much, Leigh. And then from my side, all the best with your doctoral studies as well, on top of running a company. That's very inspirational to someone like me.
Where I'm at with that. Don't even.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We're going to end the meeting now. Please keep safe and love to your family. Bye.
Thanks, Maxine.